Hello everyone. Today I would like to give a brief review for the last two volumes in Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun, The Sword of the Lictor, and The Citadel of the Autarch. These are commonly sold together in a bind-up called Sword and Citadel, so that's how I'm reviewing them here today, and that's because I think my thoughts about these last two books really blend together. They're very similar, so I'm reviewing them both at once here. Really, this is my favorite part of The Book of the New Sun. This is where a lot of the things that have been confusing in the first two volumes become more clear. We get a lot more answers, but those answers are answered in the form of questions. And a lot of things in these last two volumes point us back to the beginning and recontextualize a lot of the story that we've already experienced and help us see it in a brand new way before. Personally, of these two volumes, The Sword of the Lictor is probably my favorite. This is, in a sense, the action book. This is where all of the most exciting parts of Book of the New Sun occur in that volume, so I really like it. But also, a lot of the exciting moments of the ending of this story and seeing a lot of the promises that Severian has made throughout the Book of the New Sun get paid off in Citadel of the Autarch. So even though there are some things in that book that can be difficult to understand or difficult to see what Wolfe is getting at there, that payoff is just so incredibly exciting that that volume is one of my favorites of the series as well. To go over the plot of these last two volumes briefly, I would say that these are the most cyclical books in Book of the New Sun. A brief spoiler warning for the whole Book of the New Sun. I'm not going to go out of my way to spoil bunches of details from these books, but with these being the last two books in the series, and I'm specifically reviewing them, I will give a spoiler warning for them and for the first two volumes. So The Sword of the Lictor begins with Severian finally making it to Thrax, the place he's been journeying for all of the book so far to get there. And he doesn't stay very long in Thrax. He stays there for a while with Dorcas, and shortly after he allows a prisoner to escape instead of executing her, similar to what happened with Thecla in the very first book, he is self-exiled in a sense. He flees Thrax and ends up going on his own wilderness experience out in the wilderness beyond Thrax. We talked about this a little bit in my biblical symbolism on Sword of the Lictor video, but there out in the wilderness he encounters aliens and wizards and a symbolic version of the devil, angels, demonic forces, and finally he makes his way to the war that we've been hearing about for the entire Book of the New Sun. He encounters the war of the Askians and joins up with the Autarch's army and sees this war firsthand. Ends up encountering the Autarch and through a process that I won't fully give away here in case you're watching this and haven't seen it, ends up becoming the Autarch by the end of the book and returning home to the Torturers Guild in Nessus as the Autarch. And so we see a riff on the hero's journey that Gene Wolfe is playing with here. In a lot of ways, this last part of Book of the New Sun can feel the most Wolfian. As I said before, we see a lot of answers to questions, but many of those answers are just as confusing as the questions that were asked. But also, Wolfe himself was a war veteran, and I believe it was the Korean War. And he wrote about how he dealt with a lot of PTSD from that. And similar to Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, there's a weight that is behind his writing and how he writes about war. It's not sensationalized, it's not cinematic in the way that a lot of modern fantasy is written. There's almost a sorrow behind how he writes war, and a very unglamorous way in how he writes the chaos and the tragedy, and people that you know and that you've been going alongside in your journey can just be eliminated in a second by the random chaos of destruction that's around you. And for Severian, this is also a very shocking experience, as he's been hearing echoes of this war, but now finally experiences this firsthand. And really, these last two volumes are where Severian as a character grows the most. He's been a very unsavory character for most of the Book of the New Sun up to this point, but being isolated, being forced to spend a lot of time alone, a lot of time in contemplation, and then also being a father figure for a good part of The Sword of the Lictor, he changes as a person. And many of the justifications that he makes earlier on in the series for his bad behavior, we see him reflecting and seeing things in a different light as the series goes on. He has to spend time in solitude and time caring for others, and this just takes him farther down that road of virtue. And this is seen symbolically in the story when he loses Terminus Est. Terminus Est, his sword of execution, is destroyed, and he leaves it behind and goes forward down his journey. Early on in Sword of the Lictor, he gives a very eloquent justification for his use of torture and the role that torturers play in this society to Dorcas. And yet at the end of Citadel of the Autarch, his actions completely refute that justification that he made early on. This reminds me in many ways of one of Wolfe's influences, which was Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky is famous for what people call Iron Manning many of his opponents' positions. So rather than straw manning and giving all of his opponents, his ideological opponents, the weakest arguments, he gives them the absolute strongest arguments for their positions that he can come up with. And then he shows the deterioration that living in that way or believing that way will cause to a person, the ways that that will harm them. And Wolfe does a similar thing here with Severian's justification of torture and execution that he's held for the rest of the series. And then by the end of the series, he rejects it, moves away from that, and moves into what it seems to be a more enlightened philosophy. But also throughout Book of the New Sun, we've been getting hints as to what Severian's new sun powers might be, and we see them in much greater display in these last two volumes. We see the cosmic forces that have been influencing him, that have the push and pull between the forces of good and evil that are working behind the curtain, literally a deus ex machina, that have been trying to guide Severian down a very specific path. We get to see those more. We get to see the influence that Severian's new sun powers have on those cosmic forces, and really the magic that Gene Wolfe plays in this series, whether you want to call it, misunderstood science, whether you want to call it the power of God and the devil, whatever you want to call it, the magic in this series is, for one, it's very mystical, it's very mysterious, it feels very dark and occult, and I mean that in the literal sense of the word, but also it's incredibly engaging to read about. It feels very mysterious, but it's also very narratively satisfying as you read more and as you learn more about what these powers can do. They're vague in the sense of we don't know what he's capable of doing. Severian also doesn't know what he's capable of doing, but they don't feel so undefined that it's like Wolfe is just pulling stuff out of his armpit whenever he needs a problem fixed. Well, he just gives Severian a new power. In this book also, we get to see so much more of the world. In the first two books, it's kind of confined to, the Guild of Torturers, and then a little bit more we get to see more of Nessus, and then a lot of book two takes place just at the House Absolute, at the Palace of the Autarch, but finally in Sword of the Lictor and Citadel of the Autarch, we get to see so much more of the world of the Book of the New Sun. We get to find out more about the secrets of the past and what has come before and why the world is dying. We get to learn a lot more about that. Many of the things that have been mysterious in the first two books, we get to see in greater clarity. So one of the great examples of this is Severian has an encounter with the Alzabo elixir in the second book, but we finally get to encounter one of these Alzabo aliens out in the wild in Sword of the Lictor, and Severian gets to battle one. There's a lot of mysterious questions about this character of Father Aneri in the first two books, and although some of those questions are answered, he still remains a mysterious figure by the end of book 4, but we have a much better idea of who Father Aneri is and why he is this mysterious sage wizard type character in the House Absolute. We also get a much clearer picture of what political system the Autarch government replaced, and why the Autarch project, flawed as it may be, and though it might not be the best system, why it is so much better than the system that it replaced. And many of the words that have been thrown around in Book of the New Sun, like hierogoules and cacogens, you'll get a lot of meaning, and you'll gain a lot more understanding of what those terms mean if you look them up and see the definitions of what these old, out-of-date words mean. But even in the text itself, there is a greater clarity and definition that you get just from these later two books. And as with most Gene Wolfe books, the end of these books just point you back to the beginning. By the end of the books, you realize that there are so many keys that were hinted at even in the first chapters of Shadow of the Torturer. There's a lot of secrets that have been laid out, and now that you know more of the answers, it completely changes your reading experience. This is my second reading of the Book of the New Sun series, and I can affirm that it is a completely different experience. experience. The story is not completely different in terms of the events, but you see the events so much more different than you did the first time that you read it. Now, one question a lot of people will have is Earth of the New Sun required reading? And a lot of people will say no, and some people say yes, and a lot of people stop after the first 4 and then choose to reread the first 4 before they read Earth of the New Sun. But really, as best I can say, and I haven't reread Earth of the New Sun yet as of this video, but it really does pay to read Earth of the New Sun, because there's a lot of answers given there, as with any Wolfe book, just as many questions as answers, but there's a lot of answers there that will help you understand the main 4 books on a reread. I kind of compare this to Blade Runner. So if you ask people what version of the movie Blade Runner to watch, everyone will say, don't watch the version with Harrison Ford's narration. It over-explains stuff, it gives a lot of unnecessary information. Watch the version where all that narration is cut out. But most of the people who recommend that are people who have watched Blade Runner multiple times. They know about all the secrets of the world building, and they know about the plot, and they know what Ridley Scott is trying to do in the movie. But for a first-time viewer, many first-time viewers of Blade Runner, if they watch the version without narration, are very confused and unsure what the plot is supposed to be or what's going on. And I kind of feel like that's the same way with Book of the New Sun, where if you don't read Earth of the New Sun on your first read-through, there's a lot of things that'll be confusing and discombobulating, and not to say you won't get any of it or you won't even get a lot of it, but I think reading Earth of the New Sun in your first full read-through really will help clarify a lot of things when you are able to reread it. As I've said in a lot of these Gene Wolfe videos, Wolfe specifically designed these books to be reread, not just in how the books are written on a stylistic perspective, but also in terms of the page count. Look at these. These are very skinny, short books. Sword of the Lictor, I consistently, both times that I've read this, I've read this book in under 24 hours because it's so readable, and it's a very quick read in terms of the page count of it. So when people say reread this, it's a much different commitment than, say, when Malazan fans say you should reread that series, which is 10 books, most of which are over 1,000 pages. One of the most fascinating things, though, in these last 2 volumes is Wolfe plays a lot with genetic memory and multiple consciousnesses and what makes somebody human. What is it that makes a soul what it is? I almost think that Dune is riffing somewhat on the Kwisatz Haderach idea that Frank Herbert played with in Dune, but in a slightly more metaphysical and spiritual way in Book of the New Sun, because he plays with a lot, especially in Citadel of the Autarch, with this idea of multiple personalities inside of a brain and multiple consciousnesses. And not in a insane type of way, although in any Wolfe book it's not clear, maybe the narrator is insane, but more of a spiritually symbolic way. And how much does memory define who you are as a person? How much does that make you human? And personally, I can say it's not even clear by the end of Book of the New Sun if Severian is fully human. It's similar to Paul, like I said in Dune, where at the end of Dune, is he fully human? Leto II, Paul's son, clearly isn't fully human by the end of God Emperor of Dune. So is Severian still fully human, even though he has a human body and by all appearances seems to be human? But inside his soul, as far as the essence of who he is, he's clearly not normal by the end of this series. So that line there is something that Wolfe asks, and there's not a clear answer given. The weirdest sci-fi ideas in Book of the New Sun are in these last 2 volumes, and I love that. And we'll get into this more when we talk about the biblical symbolism of Citadel of the Autarch, but the Autarch as a symbol and Severian as a person represents all of humanity, which I think is part of what Wolfe is getting at with the multiple consciousnesses inside of Severian's mind. These different minds that are within Severian come from all sorts of different walks of life, come from different statuses in society, and that all comes together in Severian to make him the perfect candidate to be judged before angelic alien beings who will determine whether Earth is worthy to receive a new sun. I hope this review is even half coherent. These last 2 books I find to be the most difficult to talk about, but they're my favorite, and I think they have the best stuff in Book of the New Sun. When I reread Book of the New Sun, often it's the latter half of the stuff that I really look forward to. As much as I enjoy the first 2 volumes, the second 2, that's where the good stuff is. So if you've watched this far, Hopefully you've read these books already. Let me know what you've thought of Book of the New Sun. I will be reading Earth of the New Sun very soon. I can't wait. And I've also been working on reading some of Gene Wolfe's lesser-known books besides his solar cycle books. So if you have a favorite Gene Wolfe book that you would like to recommend or that you think I should read, be sure to let me know. Anyway, guys, I will end it with saying this. For anyone who's made it this far and hasn't read Book of the New Sun already, do yourself a favor and pick it up. It's not as difficult as you might expect. At the end of the day, they're just books. They're short books. Parts of it will be confusing, but that's true with any sci-fi or fantasy book. And if you take your time, and if you're willing to be patient with the book, and if you're willing to read all the way to the end, as you should with any Wolfe book, there are answers there. It might not be everybody's cup of tea, but I think everybody should at least try it. That's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.